It's 2016, and my husband and I have moved into our new home. We've purchased an apartment together, and one of the things about it that I loved is that it had really gorgeous hardwood floors. So we're moving in, and unbeknownst to us, the bottom of one of the chairs, our screw has become exposed. And as I'm moving a piece of furniture around, and there's a huge gash, huge scratch in the hardwood floor in the living room. And I am crushed. I'm despondent. My husband is like nonplussed. He's like, it's a scratch. You can buff it out. It'll be fixed. But this episode really triggered me. And it left me feeling in despair. Now, what I'm going to share with you today is the process that I have learned over many years of how to heal these kinds of emotional triggers so they don't happen at all. And this is a process of self-healing, of learning to figure out the root causes why we have emotional reactions to certain things and how to uproot those causes once and for all. And you can think of these as inner children or younger selves or emotional wounds. The process is essentially the same, of learning to travel back in time and find the origin of this pain point, this trigger, so that it can actually be healed completely. Now, I want to be clear, this process is not instantaneous. It doesn't happen overnight. And if you're looking for the ultra quick fix for any sort of emotional wound or trigger, this isn't for you. It's something that you're going to have to do over and over. And anybody who tells you that deep emotional triggers can be eradicated instantly is not telling you the truth. I'm going to start by foreshadowing the takeaway. And I'll explain more at the end. The takeaway is this: your pain, your emotional trigger, whatever it is meaningless. It is meaningless. I'll tell you at the end what I mean by that. So before we get into the process, it's important that we understand what we mean by self-healing. In the last video I did, I taught you about letting go. And letting go is the process of not pushing our feelings aside, not suppressing them and not numbing them, but actually feeling them deeply, deeply, deeply. Feeling your emotions fully and completely without any resistance. What we're really letting go of is our resistance to our emotions and our mental machinery. Very often we're quick to analyze, we're quick to tell ourselves something about this emotion. Our minds get engaged when what we need to do is feel our emotions, be present to them, be loving towards them. Now today I'm going to get into what it means to actually heal. This is fundamentally about your creator capacity, your divine capacity as a being, a spiritual being inhabiting a physical body, to create the world that you experience. And therefore, you can create a new version of yourself that experiences that emotion and can teach your prior self who experienced this emotion the first time how to see it differently. So not only are we talking about your capacity as a divine being who creates your reality, we're talking about your ability to bend time and travel to the past to rework that past moment so that the present now feels very different. You and your soul are in co-creation of your life according to the blueprint that you came in with. And your capacity to reshape reality is extraordinary. That's what self-healing really is. You are inhabiting a body and you came into this world with all sorts of karma from past lives, through the generation or lineage that you chose to incarnate into, whether it's your parents, grandparents, etc., and what you've accumulated in this lifetime. All of that is housed in the body and the chakras. So I want you to think about this process as less about self-healing than it is about self-creation. What we are actually doing when we uproot these emotional triggers and wounds and we heal ourselves is we're creating a new consciousness. We're stepping into a new version of ourselves. And that is what we are here to do as spiritual beings on this planet. Now, there is a very critical step in this process that almost everybody skips. So I'm just going to flag for you now. We're going to get to this at the end of the video. You don't want to skip it. It is the part of the process that allows you to really move forward. And if you skip it, the work is incomplete and you're going to experience this trigger again and again. Okay, so back to the story of the scratch in the floor. When I felt this despair, initially it was just a very heavy weight. I was upset that this happened. There were a lot of emotions. And my first step, of course, is to feel it all. And then, and this is the part where once you've really felt these emotions, sometimes they subside, as I talked about in the previous video, they evaporate on their own. But very often we actually do need to go deeper. And the first step in that process is to identify what it is that we're actually feeling. Initially, it just felt heavy, and I could talk about being upset, but at a certain point, I had to recognize that it felt like despair, interesting emotion, because it suggests a kind of sense of being trapped, of being overwhelmed, that the world is not what we want it to be, and we are powerless to change it. After that, I had to follow the chain of thoughts. And my thought was, the floor's ruined. First a scratch, and then it's ruined. Right? And this is where my husband provides the counterpoint and says, it's not, but I felt it's ruined. What does it mean to me that it was ruined? Right? Because a ruined suggests this is unfixable, inescapable, right? Can't be repaired. The thought that I had was, I am not allowed to have nice things. I can never have nice things. I don't deserve nice things. It's the chain of thoughts that I had to follow. Right? Again, inescapable. I'll never have them. I'm not allowed to have them. I don't deserve them. Okay? So we move from an interpretation, first an emotion, to an interpretation, the floor is ruined, to beliefs about it. I'm never allowed to have it. I don't deserve it. I don't deserve nice things. And I'm beginning to move from an emotion to a thought or an interpretation to a set of beliefs and even an identity. And beneath that, that's where I had to start going back in time. Where did this come from? When did I first experience this? And that's where I went back into my childhood, and I remembered there were many moments in my childhood, and it was a rental in an apartment complex. My family was relatively poor. We were lower middle class. We had enough money, but money was often a source of tension. We moved into this apartment, and the landlord had promised that it was going to replace the old carpet and put in brand new carpet. And when we arrived, we discovered that the landlord had in fact just had the carpets cleaned and had stained them, dyed them to look new. And this dye came off over time. It would get on our socks, it would get on our feet. And I remember being very ashamed of this. This was a sign for me of our material circumstances. And our furniture tended to be flat pack or particle board with veneers. It was often chipped or would break and things would be glued back together. I really felt, because I had a lot of affluent friends living in Southern California who lived in very nice homes, that another way was possible. And so this scratch on the floor, I had carried with me this sort of karma from the past, where I felt I was always going to be poor. That was sort of the emotional underpinning. So I went from an emotion to an interpretation to a set of beliefs to an identity. This scratch meant I'm not allowed to have nice things and I'm going to be poor just like I was as a kid. All of this was unconscious in the sense that I didn't walk around worrying about my childhood, feeling ashamed of the material limitations that I had faced. This wasn't something I gave a lot of active thought to, but it was embedded in my consciousness. So the process is first unwinding this programming. It's a program in your mind, identifying. I'm going to go over this: emotion, thought, interpretation, beliefs, identity. These layers that made up this particular program that got triggered when I scratched the beautiful hardwood floor. And I gave it this meaning. And the process here is a very gentle interrogation. You want to be very loving and gentle with yourself, of looking at this program in each of the thoughts and beliefs and identity and challenging them. Fundamentally asking, is that really true? So we already know that the floor is not ruined, it can easily be fixed. Does it mean that I don't have nice things, that I'm not allowed nice things, that I don't deserve nice things? This sense of despair was tied to that sense that I would never escape material limitation. And to gently inquire, is that really true? Did I not have any nice things? And I could look objectively and that's not true. What did it say about me that our family didn't have a lot of money? Did it say something about me and my worth in the world? Because that's ultimately a lot of what this comes down to, is that we create a meaning that says something about us and our identity, our worth in this world. And I had to look at that and say, it didn't mean anything. It really didn't mean that I didn't deserve nice things. Here are all the nice things that I did have. And I had to recognize and come up with a new story. So once you've recognized the program, you got to reinterpret. My parents were doing the best they could. We did have material limitations. This is the lesson of impermanence. And ultimately, I had to come back to a story of just the facts. I grew up without having a lot of material goods, without having a lot of nice things. Did it mean anything? No, I had to sit and feel again and again this story that my younger self was telling. And that's the reality, is this younger self was telling. I had to sit and listen and feel that despondence. And then come back to my reality. I have nice things. I've had plenty of nice things. I've had plenty of things that were nice and that got scratched or broken or ruined and then replaced or repaired. And my material circumstances don't actually reflect the material circumstances that I had growing up. So I had to honor that despondence and honor that younger self by feeling and listening, and then very gently coming up with a new version where I emptied out the old meaning. Scratch on the floor is just a scratch on the floor. Now, does this process also work for really deep emotional wounds that involve other people? Yes, it does. And sometimes these are the kinds of wounds that we think about when we think about emotional triggers or needing to heal ourselves. And sometimes they even rise to what we might call the level of trauma. So this story begins when my father decided to leave our family. And my mother and father got a divorce, and I was about 10 years old. And after that, we lived with our mother, and my father would come for visits every other weekend. And most of the time, my father would take us out to a fast food place where we would get like a soda and we'd sit. And my father tended to talk to us about his work and his master's thesis on light optics. And to be honest, it was really boring and it didn't really interest us, but we had to ask questions because this is how we got his attention. And then, I sort of drifted away from my father. The next big moment in my life was when I turned 18 and my father actually stopped sending his child support. And I remember my mother got a letter with his final child support payment, which he said, my obligation to Patrick is over. And I went ballistic. I got so angry and I called him up and I was screaming out, I'm not an obligation. This was all about his relationship to my mother, but I interpreted that and made it about me. I was very angry with him, particularly because he hadn't provided a lot of material support. And then we moved on, but ultimately we didn't have a good relationship, and my father and I were estranged most of my life. And this was a source of a conscious wound. I was very upset about having had a father who was absent, who wasn't really interested in my life, who seemed emotionally kind of obtuse, and honestly hadn't provided a lot of financial support. And when he had, it had been something that had been done very begrudgingly, or felt like I kind of had to force it out of him. So this was at the surface. This is something I was very aware of. But maybe didn't give it a lot of thought. I sort of moved on in the way that everyone says that they moved on, which means it's just percolating beneath the surface. Until many years later, when out of the blue, I learned that my father had died. And I reconnected with his sister, my aunt, who had been very dear and close to me when I was a kid, and we two had drifted apart. We reconnected, and that's when I started to really connect and tap back into these feelings. The same sort of, I would be very upset and angry, and also, why didn't I have a better father? I had friends who had great fathers who were there and loving and supportive, and so I had to go through the same process. Why didn't my dad love me, and why didn't I have a better father? A father who emulated all these other fathers that I could see as possibilities. Why didn't I deserve that? I had to go through my anger to that sense of making it about me, a meaning about me, the beliefs I had that my father didn't love me. And it left me with this existential question: why didn't I deserve a loving father? What was it about me that meant this was the fate I had been dealt? So when I started to do this work of feeling it, facing the interpretations I made and understanding the beliefs, my younger self felt like, yeah, my dad objectively, not a good dad. Barely took us out, didn't really spend a lot of time talking to us about us, didn't support me financially. I could marshal, like a good lawyer, all the evidence as to why my dad was bad. And that brings me to another important step in this process. What I finally did is I asked my aunt about this for some closure. And I learned some things about my dad that I hadn't known, which is that my grandfather, his father, had belittled him intellectually his entire life. Basically told him he wasn't smart enough and he wasn't going to amount to anything. And my father had really struggled. He struggled professionally. He died in circumstances where he didn't have money and really felt unrealized. And that's when I had my breakthrough of understanding why he had done something and why he had behaved that way. When he was sitting with me talking about his job in electronics, or talking about his master's degree in light optics, things that as a 10-year-old I really didn't care about, he was speaking to me in the only love language he really knew, which was the love language of intellect. Showing me how smart he was his way of showing me that he loved me. And the reality is that he didn't have a lot of money. And so the times that he did give money, it was actually a great sacrifice. And I had interpreted it as being very begrudging, when in fact he was doing, again, the best he could do. And the story of my father didn't love me, my father wasn't interested in me, my father didn't support me, was in fact him doing the very best he could in the only way he could. Yes, these were his limitations. But what did it say about me? Again, the process is often, what is this saying about me? What meaning have I given this? Because it says something about me and my identity, that I'm not lovable, that I wasn't worthy of a good dad. Again, it said nothing. Remember what I said at the beginning. Your younger self's pain, your inner child's pain is meaningless. It's meaningless because it was the meaning that that self created, and that can be recreated, created differently, because the younger self didn't know of its divine capacity. It interpreted the world, and it was already using its incredible capacity to create the reality it was experiencing. And that's what my younger self did. It created a story, created meaning. And all I had to do now was, with new information, create a new story where I could have some compassion for my father and compassion for my younger self. Why didn't I deserve a good father? Why did I have a father that was absent? And this is where it comes back to what it means to self-heal. Remember I said it's about self-creation, you and your higher self, you and your soul with your blueprint. And this is the part I had to accept, that my soul had incarnated and chosen my parents to heal this particular karmic wound. One of the reasons that we're all here is to help heal the karma of the generations before us. And so I had to recognize that my father leaving, which for me was one of the great wounds of my life, had actually spared me from the intellectual belittlement that he had suffered from. I didn't have a father constantly telling me, you're not smart enough, you're not good enough. And in this way, beautifully, we were able to break that particular karmic cycle. I didn't replicate that pattern in the way he had replicated it from his father. And so what's the story? The new story is that I came into this world and chose a father whose love language was intellectual, that this pattern might be broken. And what did it mean that my father related to me the way he did? It meant he loved me as best he could. That's it. My father took me out for sodas and talked to me. That's it. That's the story. So now I have a bit of a confession. The truth is that I had not entirely escaped my father's karma. And that requires my last story for this video. In the 3rd grade, I was really good at math, just like my father. So good that my 3rd grade teacher decided to move me to the 5th grade math class. And so I apparently was bored in doing the math that we were doing, and this teacher thought I needed a challenge. Well, I didn't like it. I went to the 5th grade class, and the 5th graders are like, who's this little 3rd grade pipsqueak? And my 3rd grade peers are like, oh, Patrick, why is he being sent away? Suddenly, I was a weirdo. There was a sense that I didn't quite fit in. I was literally being told, like, this isn't your place in the 3rd grade, and you should go to the 5th grade, and you don't really fit in here. I certainly have no memory of the 5th grade teacher making any effort to sort of make me feel welcome. And I remember being bored, and I didn't like this situation, and so after a few weeks, I went to my teacher, my 3rd grade teacher, and said, I don't want to do this anymore, I want to come back to the classroom. I remember the feeling that I had disappointed this teacher. I had not fulfilled whatever expectations they had. There was disappointment in this person. And I thought, oh, I get to come back to the 3rd grade and just be back among my peers. But that didn't happen either, because I was now the guy that had left the classroom, and did I fail? Did something go wrong? But now I was back in the classroom during math class. And so it created this very strange existential conundrum for me. And so I just have this memory of this time. Maybe it was a little bit before, maybe a little after. The mind does these wonderful things of sort of putting these things together. I was taken in to do an IQ test. And once again, I remember having the sense that this seemed like it was a big deal. People had high expectations. Somehow it mattered. And I could feel myself getting nervous about it. And so I actually, during the IQ test, there was one puzzle that I froze on. And I got a little more nervous. The time. And then finally I was able to somehow complete the test and got back on track. But I remember the feeling was like the upshot, Patrick's no genius. There's disappointment among the adults about how I had done. The combination of these two events, now again, I don't know which came first, which came second. I think the math class happened and then the IQ test, but it created this existential conundrum where I felt that I didn't belong with my peers. And the adults treated me like somebody who had potential or promise, and they had expectations for, but I always seemed to disappoint them. And this meant that I never felt like I belonged. I had this weird dynamic with peers and teachers and mentors. And the way that played out is that I often felt this sort of antagonism towards my mentors, wanting to prove myself to them, and at the same time wanting to defeat them and ignore them, and I'm not always going to live in your shadow. And it just felt throughout my life like competitiveness. I never associated it with these periods of time. But out of the blue, I went in a deep meditation journey that was aided by a shamanic practitioner, and these memories came back. And I remember this feeling, and I recognized that these moments in time had fundamentally shaped my consciousness and the way I related, the sense that I was trapped. If I wasn't special, I didn't fit in. And if I was special, I would ultimately still disappoint. And I had put all my effort into basically trying to do the puzzle faster, to be smarter, to be better, which is a version of the issue that my father has. Now, I didn't get this from him, but somehow, again, karmically, this showed up in my life. And what it meant is that, when I left academia, I sort of said goodbye and I turned my back on it. When I went to the law and I had my mentors, and then I decided not to follow the path of my mentors and I turned them on, there was this constant need to sort of reject these figures of authority. And what I was doing was fundamentally rejecting my third grade teacher and the proctor of this IQ exam. Telling him, you don't get to determine my worth. And again, this wasn't something that felt like this huge trauma in my life. These moments were not things that I was horrified by. It was just sudden awareness that my younger self, in his divine creator capacity, had created this way of seeing the world, being in the world. And it was such a relief to finally hear him and feel like, why did I get trapped in this sense of everybody's sort of perception of me, of whether I'm smart or not, whether I'm special or not? And so I felt what my younger self was going through from this time. And then I could also see how it played out in all of my relationships with my mentors from academia, law school, and beyond. And that's when I recognized I needed to help this younger self see that there was another option. With my entire life, I'd been playing out this puzzle. Can I solve this faster, prove that I'm really a genius, or prove that I'm really special, or prove that I'm worthy of these adults' approval? I sat with my younger self and said, do we even need to take this test anymore? We can just walk out. And so that's what I did. I walked my younger self out of that room, consciously imagining us sitting down at that table and being like, no, we're not going to take the test at all. And we walked out. And this is what my younger self needed. And I had to do this with each and every one of my younger selves. the self that felt poor, the self that felt abandoned by his father, the self that really was attempting to get out of this relationship of approval with figures of authority. Is it wasn't enough for me, Patrick, in that present moment to say, oh, that scratch can be fixed. I'm here to heal the generational karma from my father's lineage, or I just don't need to compete with anyone. I needed to get those younger selves to accept that interpretation. And this is the piece that I see all the time with people who come for readings, is they'll have this deep emotional trigger and they'll say something from the contemporary perspective, piece of wisdom, everything happens for a reason, this is a karmic issue, this is my soul's blueprint, I just need to be present, whatever it is, and they believe it. But that younger self still doesn't believe it, and that's the integration process. If you skip over it, that younger self is feeling like you're just lecturing them. You're just talking down to them. You're just telling them, like an adult, your feelings aren't valid. You have to listen to them, love them, hold them, and get them to see, I can see this world differently. And when that happens, there's a way in which that younger self comes back into your heart. This has a lot of, you might hear of, in the shamanic tradition, that might be known as soul mending. This piece of yourself needs to come back home. However you think of it, this integration process is really important. They're going to keep coming back until they've been heard and they get on board and can see the world differently. And that is when you have truly created a new consciousness. What you have before are two different consciousnesses, two different versions of yourself at war with each other. Your older self is sort of telling your younger self, you don't get it, pipe down, you're wrong. And as my friend Tony Leroy likes to say, you bring that younger self back into your heart, and then they live here. And they're not living up here, and they're not living in the emotional triggers. You need to let them back into wholeness so that they come back into your heart. And so today, I don't feel this need to topple any figures of authority. I am very comfortable with my father and the memories of him, and I don't have the emotional trigger around my material conditions. Case in point, not that long ago, the enamel on the tub got chipped. Now there's this huge patch of yellow old enamel from what was underneath the new enamel, and aesthetically it's not pretty, but I saw it and I looked at it and I was like, it can be fixed. And that's when you know that the wound is healed, because it didn't mean anything beyond that, beyond the facts of what happened. So remember, start with the emotion, let go of your resistance, feel it deeply, identify the emotion. What is the interpretation or story that this emotion is telling you about the world? And keep digging at the layers. You feel that way because, and there's going to be a set of beliefs. And why do you believe that? Because it's going to be tied to some version of your identity. And the fundamental questions that you have to ask yourself are, what does this say about me? What does this mean to me? And then you interrogate it gently. Is that true? Does it have that meaning? Almost always it doesn't. You empty that meaning out, you create a new story. And then you bring that younger self back into you, into wholeness. When they feel heard and their wounds they've felt loved enough, they will come home. So try this process. And if you feel that you would benefit from any assistance in helping to identify places where you're holding on to this kind of emotional energy and can't quite get to the layers, then an intuitive reading may be helpful for you. But I hope it works for you. And if you feel like sharing, please let me know how it goes. All right, so I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.